Oh man, I tried to. Let's do it again. We'll get that figured out, I think, by next week. I was trying to be really subtle. There's a glare on the screen from the keyboard. I was trying to move it, and then I dropped my microphone, and I'm a little bit like concerned about. We've been through a lot together, and I'm worried about. Just took a head plant down there, but man, I'm so glad you guys are joined with us today as we're in Dark Horses Part 3 now. Dark Horse, if you haven't heard in the last couple of weeks, a Dark Horse is a little known person unlikely to succeed who ultimately accomplishes great things. And we've been talking about in this series how I think inside of each one of us is the craving, the desire of maybe, just maybe, as we see other people's dark horse stories, maybe there's a dark horse story inside of me. I think God created that in each one of us, this desire for our lives to count for something, to be significant to leave our mark here on this planet before our time is up. And this series is all about exploring different dark horses in the Bible that as we look at their story, we can see what worked and what didn't work. In fact, we talked 2 weeks ago about this man named Gideon. If you didn't hear the story, go back and watch part 1. But Gideon had this incredible feeling of inadequacy. And yet, because he was able to overcome that and trust God in his situation, he was able to be used for great things. God used him to do amazing things with the nation of Israel. And then last week we talked about the king of impact in the Old Testament, the man Moses, who made such a big impact in what he did in his life, was the king of also excuses, and how he had an excuse for everything. Like God would tell him to do something, he's like, but what about this? And God's like, well, I'll take care of that. He's like, yeah, but you got that, but what about this one? And he did that 5 times with God before he finally caved in, I guess is probably the best word for it, and gave in and did what God had called him to do. Today, I thought, we've talked about a couple of men, but there are actually a significant amount of women in the Bible who have dark horse stories. And I thought we'd talk about one of my favorites today. Her name is Esther. I love the story of Esther. If you've ever heard the story in the Bible, I'm going to try. I've got such limited time, but I'm going to try and give you the whole nuances of what's going on in this story this morning. And it's going to be difficult because there is a lot happening in this short 9-chapter book in the Bible. But if you got your notes ready, get ready because we're going to dive in here. But one of the things that Esther did in her lifetime, the big dark horse story in the book of Esther, is that she saved more people with what she did in her heroic actions than anybody else in Scripture. And the only way to really grasp, maybe kind of connect to modern times to what she did, was think 1939 Nazi Germany. And there's this man named Adolf Hitler. And he's hell-bent against this nation, the Jewish people. And he falls in love with this beautiful woman. Her name is Esther. And they get married. And just before he's ready to fire the orders to go and start this genocide of 6 million Jews, Esther, whom he loves, comes and convinces him it's not a good idea. And she saves all 6 million of them. That is the caliber of the story. But this isn't 1939 Germany. This is 479 BC in Persia. And the woman Esther does something very similar to that impact here. We're going to talk today as we examine her story, 4 rules of success that is present in all dark horse stories. And her story begins, and by the way, just a little bit of a warning. We're going to dive in a lot into her story in the Bible and things that are not in your notes. So if you have your Bible today, or if you have your Bible app handy, get it ready. If you're online, the Bible notes or the Bible tab. We're going to go to the book of Esther. We're going to start right in the very beginning, Esther chapter 1, verse 1. I'm just going to kind of set up how this book begins. It says in verse 1, "These events happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Ethiopia." This is the Persian Empire. He's got hold on spots all the way down to Ethiopia and Africa, all the way from southwest there, all the way to the east side. I guess I'll let me flip it around because you guys are here. All the way to the east side to India. And he's got 127 provinces that most likely these provinces were actually nations that were conquered and brought into subjection under his rule. 127 provinces. Verse 2. "At that time, Xerxes ruled his empire from his royal throne at the fortress of Susa." Now, we're going to set this aside for just a moment because I think it'd be helpful for me to give you a little bit of a backstory for what's going on that sets the stage for the book of Esther. There's a man by the name of Artaxerxes. He's also known as Darius the First, and he was the Persian ruler before Xerxes. And there was a Greek revolt. There was some Grecians that lived in what is now the western end of modern-day Turkey, and they were the Ionians. And they decided they were going to revolt against Persia, the Persian Empire. They didn't want to be under their rule anymore. And they sent out a distress call to their Greek brothers, and the Athenians, the people of Athens, answered the call and came to help them with revolt. They quickly threw over the Persian government, and then it was brought back right under control again. But this outraged Artaxerxes, and he didn't like what they had done, so he vowed he was going to go and destroy the Greek Empire. So he mounts his whole army, and you may be familiar with the story, but he takes his whole naval fleet into what's called the Battle of Marathon. In the Battle of Marathon, he fights against the Greek, and unexpectedly, the Greeks fight him off, and he goes home defeated with his tail between his legs. He's back now at the fortress of Susa. And he vows he's going to go back and seek revenge on them for this defeat, this humiliating defeat that they gave him. He should have won. He had way more forces, way better equipment, way better everything. But they were smarter and they outwitted him. And so he's angry. He comes back and he spends 4 years planning to go back to seek his revenge, only he dies. His son is Xerxes. The Xerxes we're talking about in Scripture today. His son Xerxes takes over rule, and Xerxes takes over his father's legacy and decides he's going to continue what his father started, and spends the next 4 years with all these nations. They're bringing multiple nations together to mount this huge army, hundreds of thousands of warriors to go back and to fight the Greeks again. He works on this for 3 years. And that picks us up to where we are in verse 3 of your notes. And I want to read this together with you. He throws the party to end all parties. He's trying to get the morale high, get people in high spirits, and get ready for this thing that he's ready to do. Verse 3, in the 3rd year, so he's 3 years in now of his reign, he gave a banquet for his nobles and officials. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles of the provinces. Now get this. The celebration lasted 180 days, 6 months. I think I would need a vacation from celebration after 6 months. A tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. He did this to flex his muscle, to show them what he had and all that was in store. Verse 5, when it was all over, the king gave a banquet for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were in the fortress of Susa. So then he takes not just the nobles and the people of high rank, he invites the entire city, the entire fortress of Susa, whether they're poor or rich or whatever their status, to come in. And for 7 days, they had a celebration that was held in the courtyard of the palace garden. The courtyard was beautifully decorated with white cotton curtains and blue hangings, which were fastened with white linen cords and purple ribbons to silver rings embedded in marble pillars. Gold and silver couches stood on a mosaic pavement of the porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. So he's just showing it all off. It's like those horribly overpaid for weddings you see that maybe celebrities throw, like that. But it's the entire courtyard of this palace here. Okay. It goes on for 7 days. Verse 7, drinks were served in gold goblets of many designs, and there was an abundance of royal wine. So they're getting merry. Reflecting the king's generosity, by edict, verse 8, by edict of the king, no limits were placed on the drinking. There is no limit bar going on at this point in time. For the king had instructed all his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted. So he's getting ready for this, to mount this army up to go attack the Greeks. And he throws this big party. And when you have a whole bunch of men getting together with testosterone and a lot of alcohol, unlimited alcohol, it does not bode well. It doesn't mix well. He gets really like this ego, and he's got a beautiful wife. Her name is Vashti, Queen Vashti. And he all of a sudden decides he wants to flaunt her beauty in front of all them so they can all see her. So he summons for her to come and strut her stuff so that all the guys can be like, oh, king, wow, how beautiful. He wants to like kind of puff himself up here. Queen Vashti, she says, nope, decides she's not going, which turns out to her demise to be probably a wise choice on her part, but it ends up costing her a crown. She gets deposed as the queen, and she gets removed from her position. She's now a commoner, and he now has no queen. So for the next 2 years, he continues this process of preparing for this war against the Greeks, and that leads us up to Esther chapter 2. We're going to go to there, chapter 2, and we're going to start in verse 1. I want to now introduce to you the character of Esther that we're talking about today. Chapter 2, verse 1. But after Xerxes' anger had subsided, he began thinking about Vashti and what she had done and the decree he had made. So his personal attendant suggested, let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint agents in each province to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem at the fortress of Susa. Haggai, the king's eunuch, is in charge of the harem, will see that they are all given beauty treatments. They're basically putting together a beauty contest, okay? They're plucking out all the beautiful select women out of all these 127 provinces to be brought forward, the select elite few that they're now going to strut before the king to see which one he likes the best, and not in a good way. This is in a lot of ways probably legal prostitution. The king wants to be able to have his taste of each one of these women. This is what's going on here. Then verse 4, after that, the young woman who most pleases the king will be made queen instead of Vashti. This advice was very appealing to the king, so he put the plan into effect. So Esther happens to be one of these women that is noticed to be beautiful. She's a young Jewish woman. Her parents had died, and her cousin, who's older than her, more like an uncle figure, Mordecai, ends up taking her into his own house after she's orphaned. And he raises her up. And under Mordecai's house, she's now recognized as this beautiful woman, and she's brought into this beauty contest to be brought before the king. This is where her position is. And for 12 months, they went through the process of training these women proper, how to be royal, and they gave them like a whole bunch of beauty treatments, all this kind of stuff. Went on for 12 months. But while this is going on, the king's not there. The king has left. He's gone to war. He's now ready. He takes his army and he goes back to Greece to take vengeance for his father. And you may be familiar with this battle because it was chronicled in the very well-known blockbuster hit in 2007, 300. This is the famous Battle of Thermopylae between King Leonidas, played by Gerard Butler, and the Persians. And if you watch the movie, you kind of have a little bit of a picture in your mind, but this massive fleet of naval ships coming in on the Mediterranean into the Greek coast. And then this huge land army coming up, but they have to pass through the gate of Thermopylae. This is a small pass between a cliff that drops down to the ocean and a sheer cliff on the other side, and that's the only way in. And so 300 Spartans, brave warriors, special forces under King Leonidas' command, come in, and they stand in the gap, and with 100,000, 200,000, maybe up to 250,000 Persians coming up against them, they fend them off, 300 men for 3 whole days. King Xerxes is angry. He's fuming because he's being shown up by 300 men for his entire vast army. And if it weren't for some Greek who basically betrayed his nation and showed the Persians the back pass, the goat pass around behind Leonidas and his troops, they probably would have held him for much longer. But they end up going around the backside and they end up taking out, they all fought to the death. And then they decide to descend on Athens because now he's going to take revenge on the city. And he's fuming angry that he just got showed up by 300 men. He comes in there and he levels the entire city. But here's the thing. Because of Leonidas and those 300 Spartans holding them off for 3 days, the entire city was able to flee. There was no one there when they showed up. And they escaped to the island of Salamis, which is opposite of Athens. There's a narrow strait of water, and then this island. They escaped there. King Xerxes now has to fight a naval battle. But this isn't too big of a deal for him because he's got this fleet that's 4 times the size of the Greek fleet, and his sailors are way better trained. But the Greeks lure him into this narrow pass, and one by one, while King Xerxes is watching from the shore, he picks off, the Greeks begin to pick off one ship at a time until they actually capture or sink every single ship in the fleet. Xerxes is now going home with his tail between his legs. Once again, the Greeks have beaten the Persians, and he's not happy. But he has one consolation because he knows before he left, they set this beauty contest into order, and all these beautiful women are being prepared for him. He gets to come back and choose himself a bride. So that is the scene. That is the setting for where we walk into our story. And today, from the story of Esther, we're going to pick out 4 rules of success that you see in every dark horse story. So if you're paying attention, get your notes handy because we're going to dive in. Here is rule number 1. Number 1, refuse to let your disadvantage be an excuse. Refuse to let your disadvantage be an excuse. We talked last week, the entire message was all about excuses. Don't let your excuses be the disadvantage, the crutch that keeps you from being used by God. Esther didn't do that. Excuses are kryptonite for dark horse stories. They will weaken you. Every time you buy into any of the excuses that you have in front of you because of your disadvantage, because of your situation and your circumstances, you will be basically cut at the legs, and you will not pursue and go forward in the thing that God has called you to do. I want you to look with me. This is in your notes, Esther 2:20. This peculiar phrase here. It says, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. So Esther goes into this beauty contest with the king, and she is favored above all the women, and she gets chosen to be the king's next queen. But it says after that Esther continued to keep her family background and her nationality a secret. Now, why would she do that? Potentially, this is a disadvantage for her in this situation. And she's holding it back. She's not going to talk about this, but imagine you're putting yourself in Esther's shoes. Esther is a teenage girl, 16, maybe 17 years old. She's a virgin. She's being paired up with the king of Persia, 127 provinces under his rule from Ethiopia to India. He's probably in his 40s, and to put it as discreetly as possible, not a virgin. The king gets whatever he wants when he wants it. Esther is a pauper. He has the wealth beyond imagination. Remember the 180-day feast that he threw? Esther is an orphan. He's a king. Esther's Jewish, which he does not know. He's Persian. The odds are stacked against her. But here's the thing you need to understand. Esther, stood strong in spite of the intimidation. See, she didn't have everything, but she used what God gave her. And she was faithful to carry out what God had called her to. I've many times thought, if I had the opportunity that would match my capacity, I would be so much further along in life. I remember when I played football in high school, I came from a small private school with a middle school football team that I was a part of, and I was sort of one of the stars on the team. And then I advanced to Aloha High School, where I'm a small fish now in a very big pond. I was 115 pounds as a sophomore. You don't get very far as a 115-pound football player. And I thought to myself, at this time, I remember, if only the coaches knew how good I was. If only they knew. The opportunities that would be before me as a star on the football team for our varsity high school football team would be endless. The fame, the glory, like you work it up in your head. But have you ever wondered if your boss really knew how good you were, how far you would go? Have you ever wondered if other people really knew your capacity and your capabilities, how far you would go? See, Esther didn't have a whole lot of capability. She didn't have a whole lot of capacity. Esther didn't have influence. She was a nobody. She didn't have prestige. She was a pauper. She didn't have a reputation to precede her, so when she came, like, oh, this is Esther, listen up what she says. No, she had none of that. But she used what God gave her. I think what we have to understand is this. Esther didn't have a whole lot of capacity. That much is true. But what she did have is impeccable character. Character will take you so much further than your capacity. In fact, that's a fill in your notes. Each one of these rules, there's a principle to listen up to. And on this one, focus on character more than capacity. See, any good leader knows this, that if someone has poor character and high capacity, do not touch them with a 39.5-foot pole. I was taught in leadership growing up, as you know, in the church world, that if you're hiring people on your staff team, if they are the shiny object because they are so talented and can do so much stuff, but their character is lacking, stay away from them. Because you can train capacity, you can train people in their capabilities, you can bring them up in potential, but people of bad character, it is almost nearly impossible to train bad character to good character. Esther had impeccable character. Focus more on your character than on your capacity. See, our victory has far less to do with our capacity and far more to do with our character. Remember that. Rule number 2. Rule number 2 is this: be shrewd and innocent. Be shrewd and innocent. What do I mean by that? I'm actually paraphrasing a quote from Jesus in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 10, verse 16. Jesus says, I'm sending you as sheep among wolves, therefore be as harmless as doves and as shrewd as snakes. Well, we get the harmless as doves, the innocent, innocent as doves. We get that piece. But shrewd? Shrewd isn't really the word you think of. And Jesus, of all people, spoke these words. What is shrewd? I looked it up in the dictionary. Shrewd is having or showing astute or sharp judgment in practical matters. And it actually has a little phrase on the end that says it sometimes compromises your moral character. See, Jesus says, be shrewd, but be innocent in your shrewdness. Keep your character in order. Okay? Because I'm sending you as sheep among wolves, you will get eaten alive. You'll be spit out, chewed up and spit out if you go in just as innocent. You have to have shrewdness as well. That's something that Mordecai, Esther's uncle had. We're going to see that in a second. That's also something that Esther possessed as well. In fact, look at Esther chapter 2. I'll get this down. Esther chapter 2, verse 22. But Mordecai heard about the plot. There is a plot. In fact, I want to back up verse 21. If you look in your Bibles, it's not in your notes. Verse 21, just give a little backstory. One day as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, his bodyguards, Bigthana and Teresh, who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, became angry at the king Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. They were going to take his life. But in verse 22 in your notes, Mordecai heard about the plot and gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. It's interesting. Why? Mordecai was already part of the king's court. He was always present in this palace area. Why is it when he heard about this that he didn't take the news straight to the king himself? Because his cousin, Esther, needed some change in her pocket. So he goes to Esther and he's like, Esther, I just figured this out. Go let the king know about this. So that she goes, tells the king, they thwart the plan, and the king's life is spared. The king's life is saved because of Mordecai's actions. But Esther gets the credit. Mordecai was shrewd in that moment. He knows if I give this to Esther to hold in her pocket, this may come up later on. This may prove valuable to her in this situation. See, Esther was shrewd, by the way, not because she was smart. She's an inexperienced, young, innocent Jewish woman. She wasn't shrewd because she was smart. She was shrewd because she was brave enough to ask what she did not know. And that brings us to the principle I want to point out to you in rule number 2, and that's this. Don't be afraid to seek out advice. See, we look at what the wisest man who ever lived says in Proverbs 4:7. He says, getting wisdom is the wisest thing you can do. And whatever else you do, develop good judgment. The wisest man who ever lived penned those words. If whatever you can do, make sure you get wisdom. It's the wisest thing you can do. If there's nothing else you can get, make sure you develop good judgment in your life. How do you come by this stuff? Well, there is the school of hard knocks, which is painful and slow. Or you could do maybe the simpler, wiser thing and ask people who have gone before you. They say you're smart if you learn from your mistakes. You're smarter still if you learn from the mistakes of others. So if you can learn from people who are smarter, wiser, more experienced, who've gone the path before you, you'll advance in your wisdom a lot further. We see Esther doing this. In Esther chapter 2, verse 15, it says when it was Esther's turn, this is now after the beauty contest, she's getting ready to go be presented to the king. It says when Esther's turn to go to the king, she accepted the advice of Hegai, the eunuch in charge of the harem. She doesn't know what a 40-year-old Persian prince wants or needs or likes. So she leans into the advice of his eunuch, Hegai, in charge of the harem, to say, what would the king want from me? What is it that he likes? And I will only bring with me whatever you think is the right thing to do. I will bring that with me. She asked him for nothing except what he suggested, and she was admired by everyone who saw her. There's the results, is that she stood out because she was willing to ask for advice. She learned from that situation. And if we look in Esther 2 verses 20, we already talked about the fact that she kept her family background and nationality secret. And you find out why at the end of verse 20. It was because she was still following Mordecai's directions, just as she did when she lived in his home. See, Esther was accustomed to getting advice. Esther was accustomed to listening to other people who have gone before, who knew more than she knew. And she was willing to lean into that and learn from that. Can you imagine how much further we would advance in our careers as parents, as spouses, in anything we did, if we were so hungry for advice and so humble to learn from and apply what we learn from the people who go before us? We would advance so much quicker if we did that. But herein, I think, lies one of the most overlooked secrets to successes in dark horse stories, is that we're afraid to ask for advice. I thought about that. Why would we be afraid to ask for advice? I came up with 4 reasons that I know I've faced within my own life. Too embarrassed. Have you ever been in a class at school and you're like, I have a dumb question, but I'm afraid to put my hand up because then everyone will know how dumb I am, right? Which leads into my second thing. We're afraid to look foolish. Too embarrassed and we're afraid to look foolish in front of the teacher, in front of our classmates, in front of our coworkers, in front of the people in our life. We're afraid. Can you imagine if your kid knows more about you and you have to ask them for help on how to use your smartphone? You kind of feel stupid in that moment, right? Look stupid, because you look stupider when you don't know how to use it. The problem is we're so afraid of looking dumb that we end up looking dumb anyways by trying to hide the things that we don't know are our weaknesses. And if we would just be open about it, be authentic, be real, say, you know what? Maybe this is a dumb question, but here's my question. You know that I found out in a classroom setting, odds are in a class of 30 to 40 kids, if you raise your hand and ask a question, 3 or 4 more kids are like, oh, yeah. They wanted to answer the same question, but they were too scared to raise their hand for fear of looking stupid. So take a leap of faith. Ask for advice. Here's another reason. This one goes kind of the opposite side. We want full credit for our accomplishments. We won't ask for advice because if we get advice from someone else, then they helped us and we didn't accomplish it on our own. We can't take full credit. We have to go, well, I followed through on this, but I actually have to give credit to props to this person because they're the ones who told me what to do. And we're afraid that if we ask for advice in a situation we can't take full credit for, it's a pride issue. And the last one, we don't want to appear weak. Maybe you're a supervisor at work and you're meeting with your team and they ask a question and you don't know the answer to that question. You can act and pretend like you know it so you can appear like you're strong in front of your subordinates. Or maybe you could say, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to find out and I'll get back to you guys. But what if that makes you appear weak to your team? Maybe they see your vulnerabilities and they see this is their chance to strike. They're weak. I'm going to take their spot at work. I'm going to show the boss how I'm better than they are because they didn't even know the answer to this question that I knew. We're afraid to appear weak. You realize how many opportunities have been missed in my life, and I'm sure in your life, because we were too afraid and unwilling to ask for advice? I hope you get the point this morning as we talk about rule number 2. If you want to be shrewd, you have to be wise. And to be wise, you have to ask for advice. You already know what you already know. If you're not asking questions, you're not learning. You're not growing. You can't get wiser unless you get advice from someone wiser than you. And in fact, I have a little exercise for you. It's one of our next steps today, and that is I will seek advice for a challenge I'm facing this week. I want you to come up with this week at least one challenge. Small or large, it doesn't matter, but one challenge where you don't know the answer to it. Or you think, I might know it, but I'm not sure. And I want you to go to someone who you think might have the answer and ask them that question. Because you need to get accustomed to asking for advice when you don't have the answer. That's not a weakness, that's a strength. It makes you wiser and it makes you stronger and it makes you more respectable. People are more willing to follow a leader who knows that they're not always right and they have weaknesses. Because here's just to be honest with, I want to be honest with you. They already know anyways. They just feel like a sigh of relief when you actually admit it. They know your weaknesses. The people in your life, your kids, they know where you're weak. They just want to go, oh, okay, they know it too. Okay, and they're not afraid to admit it. It actually is a sign of strength when you're willing to do that. So dark horses are shrewd and innocent. Here's the third rule I want to point out to you. The third rule is be prepared for the challenge. Be prepared for the challenge. I want to go back to Esther's story and continue it. We're going to pick up now in chapter 3, starting in verse 1. So if you got your Bible, follow along with me. We're going to introduce a new character now. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman. Haman was the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. He was second to the king. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. So we got a situation here. Haman is full of himself. He wants to be treated when he walks out the palace gates as though he is a god. And he wants people to bow to him and worship. The problem is Mordecai is a Jew and he only bows to the one true God, which is the God of Israel. And he will not bow to Haman, he refuses to. It makes Haman furious. An interesting thing, it says in here in verse 1 that Haman was an Agagite. Who was Agagites? Agagites were actually descendants of King Agag from the Amalekite Empire years ago, like 500 years prior, when the Jewish nation comes into the land of Israel. And Saul, the first king of Israel, actually goes and conquers the Amalekites. And through that process, they sack the entire city, and King Agag is killed. This is a descendant. This is a guy now who's nursed a grudge against the Israelites for so many years. Now, here's another interesting thing. If you go back to chapter 2 and verse 5, you'll find this. It says that if I can find it here. At that time, there was a Jew the Jewish man in the fortress of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and was a descendant of Kish. I've never noticed this before. Why does the Bible mention these kinds of things? Who cares who he was? Except for Kish was Saul, king of Israel's dad, from the tribe of Benjamin. And now Mordecai is found out to be this Jew who's a descendant of the king who sacked this guy's descendant, Agag, and he's for this many years has nursed this grudge. And now Mordecai won't even bow to him in worship. So he's fuming. He wants to get revenge. But it's not enough to just take revenge on Mordecai and kill him. He wants to annihilate the entire Jewish race in the provinces that the Persian Empire is under rule. He wants to kill all of them. Now, he goes to the king, and he says to the king, as second in command, King, there's this race of people mixed among us that don't follow our rules, and it's not good to have them in our kingdom because they'll be rebellious. And he convinces the king to create an edict, signed with the king's signet ring, that there will be a day where they basically will go out and wipe out all the Jews in the kingdom. This is serious stuff. This reminds me of World War II. And they're mysterious, superstitious people, so Haman can't just go out and do it the next day. They cast lots, this thing like tossing dice in which to see where the numbers land. And it lands on the 13th day of the 12th month, which gives the Jewish people 11 months to live before they are annihilated. 11 months. Esther is in the palace. She's insulated from all this, doesn't know what's going on. She hears that Mordecai is in mourning because he's heard the news, and she sends message to him and gives him clothes, and he's like, I refuse that because our people are in distress. And he sends back to Esther and says, Esther, our people are going to be killed. And then he puts before her a huge, huge request. He tells Esther, he says, I know how serious this is, but will you go to the king and plead for the lives of your people? You got to understand, in those days, the queen was not allowed in the king's presence unless invited. And Esther writes back to him and sends a message back to him and says, if I do this, it could be my life. It is against the law. The king hasn't asked for me for 30 days. Unless I come into his presence and he holds out his gold scepter as a sign of favor to me, I could possibly be killed. They could take my life for this. Teenage girl going into the king to request the life of her people. But Mordecai says, Esther, you don't understand. God will save his people one way or the other. Either he's going to do it through you or your people are going to be wiped out. Do not be disillusioned to think that you're going to be saved, because it's when it's found out that you're a Jew, your life will be taken too, and your family will be wiped out, and God will save his people through someone else. That's how Mordecai replies to her. So I love now, as we talk about this idea of being prepared for the challenge, because this is a huge challenge that Esther's been faced with. Look at how Esther responds to Mordecai in your notes, Esther 4, verses 15 through 16. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa, all of the city here, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. This is serious stuff. Go and plead before God for 3 days, on your knees, begging God for favor with me in the situation. She says, my maids and I will do the same. And then, this is crazy, and then, though it is against the law, as a teenage girl to the king, as this pauper orphan teenage girl, I will go to see the king. And I love this phrase. It gets me choked up when I think about it. She says, if I must die, I must die. The resolve in this situation for this teenage girl faced with her life and death situation, she doesn't have to do this, but she goes to plead on behalf of her people to the king. And she says, if I must die, I must die. That is my fate. I will take it. Are you that resolved in the situations that God has called you to in your life? That you're willing to go even to death if God has called you to that? Here's a principle I want to point out to you in your notes. Predetermine your actions. Do you know, if you decide that you want to get healthy and go on a diet and exercise, but you decide tomorrow morning whether or not you're going to eat healthy when it's time to eat, or whether or not you're going to get up an hour early to exercise in the morning, whether or not you feel good to do it, you'll rarely be able to maintain that kind of a habit because your emotions will always get away. But if you determine ahead of time that no matter what, I'm exercising tomorrow morning, and no matter what, I will eat healthy, it's not a choice, then you have a lot higher chance of success. I heard a story recently of a guy who was flying on an airplane, and they were coming into the runway. And as they approached the runway, just getting ready to touch down, a sheer wind came in and kicked the tail of the plane out. And they went sideways for a moment, and the airplane touches down on the runway, kind of bounces. You ever had one of those hard bounces on the runway? And this guy's like, dear God, we're all going to die. The plane's going to roll. It's going to tip over. But no sooner had the plane hit down and bounced back up, you hear the engines fire up again, and the plane levels out and takes back off in the air, circles back around, and finds another attempt and lands safely with the plane. This guy says, as soon as I get off the plane, the first thing I did was I kissed the ground. And he said, and then I went and found the pilot and I kissed him too. But the interesting thing, he says, I asked the pilot, he said, in that situation, there's so much stress, so much tension, there's so many things to consider in that moment. And then the wind hits unexpected. You didn't have time to prepare for that. Like, how long did it take you to decide that you were going to pull up instead of trying to land the plane? He said, that was amazing. He said, I made that decision 20 years ago in flight school because they told us that if you ever get into trouble, the air is a lot more forgiving than the ground. And so instantly, it was a reflex to throttle up and take back off because he knew from flight school, that was a decision he made 20 years ago. Let's talk potty training. Now, some of you guys have had the pleasure of potty training your kids. Some of you guys are in the process right now. God bless you. But every one of you here has been potty trained, I hope. Right? Okay, I'm hoping. Please tell me that's true. But I thought of this years ago, the potty training principle. When I was a child, I remember vaguely the memories of when I was going through the process of being potty trained. Now, you know, a kid in diapers, when they have the urge, they just go. And we wish they wouldn't, but they do. And then we get to clean up the mess in the diaper. And then there comes an age where it's now time to train them to use the toilet, use the bathroom. And so we go through this process. And in this process, there's times where there's victories where they do it. And then there's times where you find a present on the floor next to the toilet. And then there's times where they just decide they are having too much fun and it'd be too costly to go do that now. I want to keep having fun. And they just go in their pants. I remember getting called from our preschool teacher because our daughter had no change of clothes. She had been potty trained for like almost a year and just one day decided she was going to pee her pants at school. I remember when I was in first grade. And I had a birthday party with a friend. We had played at the park, and I had to go to the bathroom so bad, but I just was scared to death of the outhouse at the park, didn't want to use it. And so I sprinted back to my friend's house, and everyone was so slow getting back there. And I'm standing there like doing the full potty dance, like doing my thing. And then finally, I was just like, this hurts too much. And I was like, I remember that day. And I was old enough to be embarrassed by it, and I was worried that my friends would see me with my wet pants. And I remember that. I was old enough and mature enough to understand that was not a good thing, but I just did it anyways. It's been 40 years since I've done that. And I've never once been tempted to do it again. And yet, anybody in here right now who's like, Mike, please hurry up with what you're trying to say because I've really got to go. You're sitting out there right now, and not once has the thought crossed your mind, maybe I'll just go. Has it? See, long ago, we became mature enough that we begin to understand that there's a time where we could, but we shouldn't, and we never looked back. We never said, maybe I will, maybe I won't. When it comes to dieting, we go, maybe I will, maybe I won't. When it comes to hitting the snooze on our alarm to get up for work, we're like, maybe I'll hit snooze, maybe I'll get up. We have this battle that we fight over and over again. We have not decided in advance, no matter what, we're going to do this. It's not a reflex. We're actually making the decision, but we're making it with our emotions because in the moment, we're emotional about the way we feel. And it's never good, so we're not really good at denying pleasure in the moment. And so we hit the snooze and go, 9 more minutes. But we don't do that when it comes to going to the bathroom because we all got to a point of maturity where we decided that was not the wise thing to do. My friends, there is a time in your life when God calls you to something where you predetermine in your heart, it doesn't matter what He's called me to. If I must die, I must die. And I've made that. I've come to peace in terms with that in my heart, that God, whatever God has called me to, I'm going to do it. As long as I feel God has called me to it, I will go even to death. I will not look back. Because the potty training principle says this: once you resolve to do or not do something, your success is guaranteed. The only thing that could break it up, I mean, it's all but guaranteed, is like a way crazy, unpredictable circumstance out of your control. You couldn't hit the snooze alarm because the power went out in the middle of the night and you had no control over it. Those are the kinds of things. But If you're in full control and you predetermine you're going to do something, you will succeed so long as you predetermine in advance that's what you're going to do. That's what Esther says. She says, if I must die, I must die. And whatever God has called you to, that you hold to and you follow through with doing whatever God has called you to. Here's rule number 4. See the plan through. You need to see the plan through. So it's one thing to have that mental exercise of determining in advance, yes, I'm going to do this. I've resolved I'm going to do this. But then there comes a day where you actually have to eat healthy. You have to actually jog or do your workout routine. You can't just resolve in your mind. You have to follow through for anything good to happen from those decisions. And Esther saw the plan through. In fact, if you look in Esther chapter 5, verse 1 to 2, on the third day of the feast, Esther put on her royal robes and entered the inner court of the palace, just across from the king's hall. This is the big day. This is the big moment. The king was sitting on his royal throne, facing the entrance. Drum roll. When he saw Queen Esther standing there in the inner court, and I think of like a movie scene or like a reality show where we're coming to the climactic moment, we're waiting to see what happens, and the music comes up to this big moment, builds, and then silence. And then there's this pause, and we're waiting to see what happens on the other side. That's where we're at in this moment. The king is sitting there. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the inner court, he welcomed her in and held out his gold scepter to her. The moment has arrived. She follows through, and she gets the king's favor. Esther goes on to share her request. Her request is that she wants to have dinner with him, the king, and Haman, his second in command. He says, okay, sounds like a good idea. So he calls Haman, and they have dinner together, the three of them at a banquet. And he tells Esther at the banquet, he asked her first when she came to see him, what do you want? Up to half my kingdom, I will give it to you. She comes into this banquet, and he asks her again, okay, Esther, what's your request? And he says, up to half my kingdom, I'll give it to you. And she says, something's not right. I don't know what it was. One day when I get to heaven, I want to ask her what was going on in that situation. But she holds up, she hesitates. She doesn't give her request. She says, my request is that if you and Haman can come back for a banquet tomorrow night, and then I will share with you what this is all about. The king says, very well, let it be done. Haman is on cloud 9 because he's with the king and the queen, not only once, but he gets called back for a second time to be in their presence to banquet with them. No one else in the entire kingdom gets this privilege. He leaves ecstatic until he sees Mordecai, not bowing to him again, and it just puts him in a funk. So he goes home and he's complaining to his wife, wah, Mordecai won't bow, blah, blah, blah. And she says, you're second in command. The king will allow you to do this. Why don't you just put him to death? And Haman's like, that's a great idea. So he commissions this 75-foot pole to impale Mordecai, and he commissions it to be built. Next day, he's excited. He's the first one back to the palace. But little does he know, when he comes back to the palace, the king couldn't sleep all night. And when the king can't sleep, he calls one of his attendants, to read from him the annals, the records of his reign. And wouldn't you know that it pulls up to the exact record where Mordecai thwarted the assassination attempt on the king's life. And the king says to Mordecai, or says to the attendant, he says, what was ever done for Mordecai? And he says, nothing. He goes, we need to change that. About that time, he hears the commotion outside of the palace courtyard, and he calls Haman. It happened to be Haman. He calls me and says, Haman, what should I do for the person that the king wants to honor? And Haman, full of his ego, thinks to himself, who else would the king want to honor but me? So he says what he would want. He says, King, what you should do is put your horse, your own steed out there, and you should put this person you want to honor on the horse in your royal robes and have him go around and have a herald stand in front of him, walking him through the city streets saying, this is what happens to the person who the king wants to honor. And the king's like, that is an amazing idea. Do that for Mordecai. So now Haman gets to herald the street. Hey, here's the person the king wants to honor. Like he's like humiliated because he gets to be the one to walk Mordecai through the city streets. This guy he hates. But he has one consolation because that night he gets to come back and have a banquet with the queen and the king. Is like, so it's not all bad. We get back in this banquet and the king's like, okay, Esther, what's this all about? What is it that you want from me? And she says, King, I want you to spare my life. There are people who want to take the life of my people. And the king gets infuriated. He says, who dares to try and stand against the queen, the king's queen and her nation? And she's like, him. Haman's just like, what? The king is so angry. This is his second in command. He trusts Haman, and he's so angry, he walks out of the room to control himself. And while he does that, Haman, desperate for his life, lunges at the queen where she's lounging on this couch having this feast. He lunges at her, and he's pleading for his life. The king hears, he comes back in, and he thinks that Haman is manhandling his wife. He says, have you no shame in my own court? In my own quarters to be coming on to my wife like this? He takes Haman out, and guess what? Haman gets impaled on the pole that he created for Mordecai. That's what happens. Not once in the book of Esther is the name of God mentioned. Not one time. Go look at it. Go check it out. Look for yourself. Not one time is the name of God mentioned. Why? Why do we have this story in the Bible? I think maybe as a message or a reminder to us that sometimes you can't hear God, but He is always there. And in your notes, the principle I want you to fill in this is that look for God even when you can't hear Him. Look for God even when you can't hear Him. You don't think that He's working, but He is. Just because you can't see Him, just because you don't know what's going on, He is there. God is everywhere. In fact, God was in Esther's appointment to be the queen. What were the odds that she would become the queen of the Persian nation? God was in Mordecai's discovery of the plot against the king. What are the odds that he would overhear two guys plotting the assassination of the king and be able to share that information? God was in Haman's building of the pole and the timing of it. The day before he wants to kill Mordecai, he's building this pole. And what are the odds that the queen, I don't know what was not right, that she held off giving her request to the king and waited one more day so the king, what are the odds that the king that night would have trouble sleeping and hear once again the story of how Mordecai saved his life so he could honor him and show Haman's true side? What are the odds that God is working in your life? What are the odds that He's present in you? You see, He's everywhere. Not just in Esther's situation, He's present in your situation as well. I want to go back and read to you Esther 4:14. The first part is not in your notes, but it says, this is Mordecai warning Esther to not shirk this responsibility. He says in verse 14, for if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And then these words, probably one of the most profound statements that I think in the Bible, one of my favorite phrases in the Bible. He says, who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this? Perhaps God has placed you in your current situation for such a time as this. That the circumstances you're faced with, He's placed you in them because He has a plan for your life. Because God is everywhere, and God is working in everything. Why do you think you have been given your house, your car, your job, your career, your resources, your talents, your abilities, the things that God has blessed you with? Why do you think He's given those to you? Is it for you to build up your own empire, to squander on yourself? Or do you think that maybe God has given you what He's given you for the purpose of standing in the gap because someone else needs what you have and what you hold? And God is trying to use you to change lives. It's not there for you to promote your own capabilities. It's there for you to serve and have the character of God and have God's heart for the people who are in danger, the people who are vulnerable in your life. Who are those people? See, you are uniquely created and positioned to stand in a specific gap on this earth to fulfill a need, to help someone out, to carry out a task that God has called you to do. And the question I have for you this morning is, will you stand in the gap? Will you step forward? Because if you think that shirking that responsibility will save your own bacon, think again. God will bring what He wants to bring about. God will make happen what He wants to happen through His means. And He's got other people He can work through besides you. The question is, are you going to allow Him to use you or not? I've said this often. I believe God has called our church to change the world. The question is, are we prepared to stand in the gap? I believe God has positioned our church in this place, at this time, in this moment, to stand in the gap to change the world. Will we step up to the plate? Will we own that responsibility? Or will we shirk that responsibility and let God carry out His plan through some other group, through some other people? See, if you don't see God, you'll continue to promote your capacity and ignore your character. You'll miss the opportunities that God has placed before you for such a time as this. I have another next step in your notes, and it's an exercise where you say, I will spend time looking for God in my life this week. maybe 5 to 10 minutes, just spend reviewing the last year or 2 or 3, and ask yourself, where has God been in these situations? Maybe not the obvious things, but where has he showed up? Because hindsight is 20/20, and we can see a lot clearly looking back than we can looking forward. And then as you go throughout this week, and you go through something that's a struggle or a difficult time, ask yourself the question, where is God in this situation? I promise you the answer is nowhere. The answer is not nowhere. The answer is he is there. He is present in that situation. And he will work in your life if you're faithful to him and let him work through you. Today, we all know, as we look around the world, that we are living in troubled times. There's a lot of unrest, a lot of things that can make us feel unsettled or uneasy. Rest assured, God is there. God is present. And it just might be, just maybe, that he has called you to this moment in time to do what he's called you to do for such a time as this. Would you pray with me? God, I pray for each person here that we would be inspired as we think about Esther's story and what you were able to do through her and so many other dark horse stories in Scripture where you used imperfect people to accomplish your perfect will. God, today we confess our vulnerabilities, our inadequacies. We confess that we have lots of excuses. It's scary, it's risky, it's challenging. The list goes on and on. But God, I pray that you would impart on each person here today a courage in spite of the fear to step into all that you have waiting for them, that whatever you've called each person here today, that we would step into that and allow you to work through us and use us, that one day we can look back and go, wasn't it beautiful what God did in that season of our lives? God, I pray that you'd inspire each individual here today to leave with a different mindset, that we would go out and do what you called us to do, much like Esther did what you called her to do. We thank you for this, Father God. In your name we pray. Amen.